Red Markets is a zombie survival horror RPG designed by Caleb Stokes and published in 2017 after a successful Kickstarter. There are a few features of this game that make it very unlike other zombie RPGs you may have read or played. The first is that it spends the first 170 of its 500 pages explaining exactly how the zombie apocalypse happened and how the geopolitical makeup of the United States changed in the wake of it. In this video, I'll try to give you a top-down view of that story, but it is a lot. The second thing is that this game doesn't emphasize combat with the undead nearly as much as it tries to simulate scarcity and poverty. It does this by creating a number of different resource pools that are constantly draining and dwindling over time. Your gear is always eroding, your humanity chipped away, and your physical health is always on the line. The third thing is that the GM and players really need to have, I wouldn't say a passion for, but at least a passing interest in economics if you want to engage with one of the major components of the game, which is the negotiation minigame, where PCs bargain, haggle, and scheme an agreed upon price for a contract or a commodity. All this to say, this is a very unique book, one that is equal parts entertaining and challenging, exciting and depressing. It's so thoroughly overwritten that it's sort of a marvel to behold. The biggest question it poses for me is, would or could any group really want to play this game? It's sort of like a Walking Dead RPG, except more realistic and gritty in terms of the realities of material supplies and mid-apocalypse economics. Let's just jump in and see what Red Markets is all about and how it's able to accomplish what it does, and maybe you can answer the question for yourself. This video is sponsored by When the Wolf Comes. When the Wolf Comes is a game of storytelling, heroism, and epic struggle set during a reimagined Norse end of days and powered by the Shadow of the Demon Lord system. The game is set in the Vikingverse, a parallel timeline where the Norse rule seas and stars with restless fleets and Christianity has been put to the Viking sword. Play as a heroic space Viking in a fully fleshed setting based on the incredible world developed and illustrated in the Vikingverse graphic novels. Choose one of 10 Norse ancestries with dozens of mythic paths and over 100 spells and gifts, all based on authentic Old Norse language and tradition. You can explore the setting before jumping in with articles, interviews, podcasts, and a free issue of the graphic novels, and even an audio guide with nearly 500 useful phrases in Old Norse.
I came, I saw, I conquered. Kom ek, sa ek, sigrata.
Grab your dragon gun and sail the stars as only space Vikings can. Back When the Wolf Comes on Kickstarter. Links are below. The first half of the massive setting lore dump at the beginning of the book is told through the voice of a character named Nat, pictured here. She is an irreverent, anti-establishment anarchist who explains to you the complexities of the so-called crash. If anything, the Blight was a tipping point that sent a dozen complex sociopolitical, economic, and environmental issues into cascading failure. That's why it's called The Crash and not Zombie Day. These 170 or so pages are a mix of personal diatribe against the corporate and political order of the United States of today, an explanation of near-future technology that became a reality just before the crash, and a narrative that follows Nat's own personal journey to her walled techno city in Colorado called Ubique City. If I had my druthers, I would have just cut out the political opining in the mini-story and just kept the technological advancements that are important to the setting and to understanding how the game's world works. Those technologies include biotech, so basically scientists were able to create crops that can withstand the ecological collapse that concurred with the zombie uprising, as well as cybernetic prosthetics that are about 15 to 20 years more advanced than what we have now. Green technology like solar, wind, and biodiesel are relatively common, so the enclaves in the setting are able to have electricity and can power their computers and phones. And probably the most important conceit of them all is the idea of a ubiquitous, indestructible network of microsatellites that provide free internet to the entire planet. The concept is a lot like Elon Musk's Starlink, but the idea here is that there's just Wi-Fi everywhere without the need for receiver dishes or any special equipment. The origins of this internet technology goes on for way too many pages, but I do think it's an important element of the setting because Wi-Fi everywhere allows the GM to connect different factions together. The most important of these is connecting the US government's bounty posts to the disenfranchised people west of the Mississippi River. All right, let me try to explain it in a nutshell. Basically, a zombie infection started popping up all over the world, and it appeared to be creating a fast living zombie, which would infect a bunch of people, and they would all turn into slow, shambling zombies. The pandemic was spread so fast that the fictional US leader, President Hunter, decided to nuke all the major cities of Canada and destroy every bridge along the Mississippi River. The reason for the latter was because neither the fast nor the slow zombies could swim, so a large, wide body of water like the Mississippi acted like a great wall as long as all the bridges were destroyed. Not only that, all citizens west of the river were deemed non-citizens in every conceivable legal way. This is a major component of the game's setting because in the game, you are in this existential hell where the US government is paying for things like driver's licenses and passports found in the western half of the country, called the Loss, in order to sell off the assets of those people they have confirmed as dead. The whole carrion economy, as it's called, is based on these government-issued IDs and the extreme value that is assigned to them by Washington. The whole concept of this economy is really pretty clever, but you probably don't want to overthink it. Some of this stuff you just have to take at face value. In the end, there are two Americas. The one west of the Mississippi is an unincorporated non-state called the Loss and is filled with millions of people living in small and medium-sized settlements scraping by. The one east of the Mississippi is called the Recession and under strict martial law. There are some cities here where people live in relative comfort, but most of the people live in equally desperate settlements and work as a sort of slave class to rebuild a society that doesn't quite seem like it will ever get there. The big bad faction of the setting is the US government's Department of Homeland Quarantine and Stewardship. It's like the Department of Homeland Security combined with about 10 other major federal departments like Housing and Urban Development, Immigration, and Department of Justice. They are essentially a massive militarized bureaucracy, one that is constantly being bribed by organized crime in the little fiefdoms that the remains of America has turned into. But there's a fair amount of science fiction going on as well. Aside from the genetically modified supercrops and the cybernetic limbs and the universal Wi-Fi, there is the zombie virus, which is not quite a virus. The authors do a good job of explaining just how inexplicable zombies are by describing the infection as a phenomenon that basically doesn't make any sense. Aside from the fast zombies called vectors and the slow zombies called casualties, there are people who are infected but who have defeated the infection somehow. They live with bulging black veins and superhuman strength, as well as chronic pain and massive social stigma. They're called latents, and there are entire towns and settlements populated by them. Then there are people who are completely immune to the zombie infection, but they are hunted down by the evil government, as well as independent research concerns, and exploited for their bone marrow. And finally, there are aberrants, which are a grab bag of any kind of wildly freakish instantiation of zombie craziness you can think of. These are supposed to be rare and extremely deadly. I could actually go on and on about the setting because there's so much written about it. I might come off as complaining about the wordiness of this first couple chapters, but after actually reading through it, I felt like it depicted probably the most well-realized and well-conceived zombie world I've ever come across. But that's for you to enjoy if you pick up this book. Let's talk about how this game actually works. The system in red markets, which is dubbed the profit system, uses a red D10 and a black D10, always rolled together as far as I can tell. The basic mechanic is that your black die, after modifications from a variety of things, needs to exceed the value of the red die, which can also be modified. If the black result is equal to or below the red result, the roll is a failure. The occasions on when you roll are pretty much identical to most other RPGs. You roll when there is uncertainty. The GM in this game, called the Markets, never really rolls in opposition to a player. They will only roll to produce environmental conditions and features such as the number and proximity of a herd of zombies or things like that. Players can spend item charges, which are abstract units of durability, in order to increase their odds of success, but actually in a lot of cases, they have to spend a charge just to use an item. If your 2 dice have matching even numbers, regardless of the target, the roll is considered a critical success. If they are matching odd numbers, the roll is an automatic critical failure. You can also spend precious will points to heavily modify a roll and improve an outcome. The dice mechanics are pretty straightforward, but there are a lot of rules variants throughout the book that come in the form of boom and bust modes. In boom mode, the game is meant to be more action-packed and forgiving. In bust mode, everything is punishingly difficult. Creating a character is pretty straightforward. You play as a taker, basically someone who goes out into the lost and collects a variety of bounties or does odd jobs for money. You start by choosing a code name, then you choose a weak spot, which is a character flaw that defines your personality. After you choose a soft spot, which is a deep passion or belief that you hold despite it getting you into danger, you then choose a tough spot, an association with a group of people or a reputation that you've gained that will afford you benefits as much as it causes you narrative trouble. Then you add 11 points across your 6 core stats or potentials: strength, speed, adaptability, intelligence, charm, and will. Then assign 20 skill points to the available skills or to ones that you make up. Almost any time that you're modifying your black D10 with a stat, you're actually using your skill rating and never your core stat or potential rating. The potential is more there just to remind you of the maximum that any associated skill can reach. After sorting through your skills, you list as many dependents as you have charm, and finally buy and upgrade your gear with your 10 starting bounty. Bounty is the name of the currency in the game, and again, it's based on recovered government IDs that can one day be traded into the federal government for other currency or property. And again, you don't want to think about that too much. IDs actually barely ever change hands and act more like gold bullion in a gold standard economy. As economically minded as this game is, the actual money and currency being traded around is pretty nebulous. Anyway, it's called bounty. A quick note on dependents. These are people you list who can help you to quickly heal humanity damage, but you have to spend bounty in upkeep to keep your connection with them healthy. Otherwise, they become estranged from you permanently. Humanity damage comes in 3 forms: detachment, stress, and trauma. As you are faced with adversity out in the loss and fail rolls, or even when you don't fail rolls, you will fill boxes from left to right. As you cross past the crack and crumble thresholds, you can't heal backwards. They are sort of one-way ratchets. And if any of your 3 humanity tracks reach break, your character is forfeit and becomes an NPC. The concept of upkeep is really what keeps you downwardly mobile in red markets. It comes in 3 forms. Sustenance is your day-to-day number that you use to calculate your breakpoint on your crew sheet. Maintenance applies to your equipment and to skill upgrades. And incidentals are most costs that are incurred from battle damage, psychological damage, and unforeseen expenses and things like that. I think it's worth mentioning the optional rule called no budget, no buy, in which players are essentially forced to spend their bounty just about as fast as they make it. The book goes into a little discussion about the psychology of poverty and the irrational hopelessness that people in that position can have. As depressing as this is, I think it's really the beating heart of this game. Not the zombies or the frankly pretty interesting backstory or setting, but the simulation of material scarcity and the weird behaviors that it produces. It may or may not be your idea of fun, but the game knows what it is and what it's trying to do, and I appreciate that. As far as combat, it's very straightforward. You determine initiative with some competing dice rolls. Highest modified roll goes first. Then each character gets a planned action, an unplanned action, and any number of free actions. Again, the GM doesn't roll. If an NPC attacks, the player rolls one kind of resistance or another to determine if they take damage. Damage comes in 2 types, stun and kill, depending on the weapon's description. And hit locations are a thing. If you land or take a hit, you roll to determine where on the body that hit takes place. As far as your character, there are 10 hitboxes per location and 20 in the torso. If your head or torso fills up with kill damage, your character dies. I can always tell when a game that purports to have simple and straightforward combat has actually been extensively play-tested, because the rulebook ends up with pages and pages of edge case rules. Generally, that's a good thing, because these are really more for reference rather than something you need to read and memorize before your first session. Nevertheless, there are rules for everything you can think of in combat here. A really interesting thing I found in this section is the discussion of the slow zombies in the game called casualties. They're kind of supposed to pop up everywhere, but they aren't really a challenge in a lot of cases. The GM will roll 2d10 to generate a gaggle of them in any given situation, and they can sometimes appear in deadly stampedes, but the game's rules dictate that if you land a single hit on one, it doesn't even have to be an aimed attack, it just gets their head and they die. Getting bit and infected is still a problem though, and interestingly, if your character ends up surviving a bite unscathed, it means that you're an immune if you didn't already start as one, and life can get really a lot more complicated for you as an immune. There's a whole block of rules and discussion in the book covering negotiations, and it's not something I'm going to cover in detail in this video, but it's worth noting that it is an extremely involved set of rules, and in the author's own admission, it seems like it constitutes another game entirely. You can see here in the rules synopsis that it's a process-oriented mode of play that involves a single player doing the negotiation while other players do concurrent side scenes called scams that may affect the negotiation itself. It's hard for me to assess this mini game without thoroughly understanding and playing it, but my initial concern when reading through it is the sheer complexity foisted on the table for the sake of simulating an agreed upon price of something. Ultimately, it poses a pacing problem. If a negotiation takes up half a session to resolve, that might be too much just to produce a number. There is a whole worksheet to help you track a negotiation's progress, and even a bunch of specialized terms. The scams that the other PCs are supposed to pursue also have a worksheet for tracking progress. In the GM section of the book, there's a pretty concise summary of boom rules versus bust rules, and some very in-depth discussions of the economics of goods and services. I mentioned this at the beginning, this game really isn't about zombies, even though you're constantly dealing with them. It's about material scarcity and the realities of living with that scarcity. As the GM, your task is to understand basic economics in order to perpetuate that scarcity realistically. Having fun yet? The ideal session prep write-up, according to the authors, is a format that requires about 1,000 words. An example is included here. I'm not sure if 1,000-word session prep is practical, but I'm glad they included an example of what they think should and shouldn't be planned in a session. The actual tables and other resources that they provide for generating a job for PCs is just about as thorough as everything else in the book, complete with entire economy types that you can implement depending on what little hellish corner of the lost your players wander into. There's actually yet another way of approaching the game from a rules perspective called MBA mode, in which players try to run a small business. This introduces a resource pool called supply, but still requires that PCs be takers who venture out into the lost and risk their lives. There are no rules to accommodate PCs who want to run a business entirely from a place of safety. Concepts like asset liquidity and work-life balance also crop up in the MBA rules, so I imagine these are the more advanced rules for players who've been around the block. All right, here are my thoughts on red markets. 500 pages. This book runs a tad long, even for something that attempts to tackle so many complex concepts. I think with the right editing, it could have probably been shaved down to 300 or 350 pages, at which point you would still have a challenging manual for a challenging game, but the ability to get buy-in from prospective players would be higher. This is a very traditional RPG in terms of the division of labor between GM and players. The GM is expected to read and understand so much more than the players, and in this case, grok some relatively unique new perspectives on a zombie apocalypse. So in a perfect world, let's say you have a well-read, smarter than average GM who has read and understood everything, as well as committed, attentive players who are interested in playing a game of economic scarcity zombie world. You'd still need everyone to derive pleasure from the fear and dread of not having enough money to maintain dependence, equipment, their enclave, and their own mental and physical health. That fear and dread is what's on offer in Red Markets. It's extremely well executed in terms of both its rules and its musings, but is it something you'd want to play? I'd love to hear your experience with Red Markets, and if you'd like to keep this channel going, please consider joining my Patreon. I've left links below. Thanks for watching. See ya.